Welcome to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, powered by R Squared Global.
Welcome to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Ryan Ray, and you're going to get a quick snippet behind the scenes here before we get into today's show. Today is, for the listeners, June 19th, and when I'm recording this. And so I recorded one earlier today with Professor Paul Sullivan, and I was talking about under the weather. And so today is still the same thing because I'm under the weather. So we don't record all the episodes in order, and so we record them a few weeks beforehand. And so anyways, I'm under the weather still today, and so I've got two more to record, but so there will be no outro. But before that, I want to let you know, be sure and go check out this website today if you're interested in what we're going to talk about. We have on Thomas Cambridge to talk about the Panhandle Import Reduction Initiative. It's an interesting take on how to reduce foreign oil to the U.S. and to partner up with our nearest allies in Mexico and Canada. They also have a link to Dr. Fine, who will be discussed in the interview. His white paper, you can find that, but you can donate, you can join, you can do a lot of stuff on the website, and that's panimportreduction.org. We will link to that in the show notes, where you can check it out at globalenergymedia.com. So, again, without further ado, Thomas Cambridge, and it was really a pleasure talking to him. He's 82 years old, and so he's been in the industry longer than I've been alive, and so it's you can sometimes soak up the wisdom from people like this. So enjoyed it. Hope you do too. And again, there will be no outro because of my voice. Tom, it's a pleasure to have you on the show today. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine, sir. I'm just having a good day.
Well, I hate to give away your age first thing, but it says on my notes here that you've been in the business since 1959. And so that means that you have seen ups and downs of epic proportion over those years. Kind of walk us through, just in your experience, the history of the oil patch and some of the ups and some of the downs that you've seen.
Sure. Yeah, I grew up in the Midwest in Iowa and went to high school and college there, and then did graduate work at the University of Nebraska and graduated with a master's degree from there in 1960. I actually completed my work in 1959 and went to work for a major company, Texaco, in the Anadarko Basin in December of 59. And, when I was in graduate school and undergraduate work, oil companies were coming and interviewing geologists and hiring lots of geologists. But in 1959, 1960, things were down in the ditch. I don't think it was because of price, although at that time I wasn't paying a whole lot of attention to price, but there was enough oil going around there, and the major fields were being found, and they didn't hire a whole lot of geologists some years. But anyway, after 60 interviews, I obtained a job in Amarillo, Texas with Texaco, and I've been living here and on Wichita Falls ever since, but I've seen lots of ups and downs in the business. I went to work in 60, and I know we had so many geologists here in Amarillo. We had our own bowling league, and that's kind of a strange way of looking at it, but we had all the major companies were here, and lots of independents, and then all of a sudden, as someone said, there's more geologists working at Sears and Roebuck than there are for the major companies because there was another downturn. So I've seen a lot of those, but I work for major companies and then smaller independents, and then went independent myself as a consulting geologist after about 8 years in the business. Now, at that time when I was with Texaco, oil was $3 a barrel, and gas was maybe 10 cents, 18 cents, something like that. So, the prices were not up there, but people were still making money and drilling a lot of wells. I drilled over 100 wells for Texaco the first year I worked for them, but it was in an existing field where the spacing was downspaced from one well per 20 acres to one well per 10 acres. And so there was a lot of work to do for geologists, and the business has gone up and down. I've always wondered, whether what I was doing was really beneficial to mankind and the world and the economy. And so, I've always wondered about that, and I checked the numbers, and it looks to me like it's helped the world a whole lot, because when the Industrial Revolution started in England in 1825, over 80% of the world was in gross poverty. And in 2025, or as we approach that, only 10% of the world is in poverty, and that, in my opinion, is due to oil and gas and the heating and cooling effects and stability that it brings to the world and the industries of the world. And so I'm pleased with that, but I have done a lot of traveling to try to see where the reserves are and how it influences the way we live in the U.S. And so I've seen a lot of that around the world too.
Okay, so I've worked, as we were talking offline here, this is my second downturn to work through. Obviously, I worked through the shale revolution when the natural gas skyrocketed and then fell off the map. But this is my first oil downturn. Lucky me, I guess. But if you do it long enough, you're going to see it. What, in your opinion, was unique about this last oil downturn that we're still kind of recovering from today?
Well, I think the unique thing is that a country, Saudi Arabia, declared war against an industry in the United States. Yamani, who's no longer in his position with Saudi Arabia's oil minister, said, we're here to drive, we want the U.S. market because we want to continue to produce and we want eventually to go public with our company and we want to capture the U.S. market. And they did come in. They owned the largest refinery in the United States, Motiva. It's in Port Neches, Texas, and it's 100% owned by the Saudi Arabian governor now. Originally, they were partners with Shell and I believe Exxon, and they negotiated to own that entirely. And then, for instance, in Texas, they have most of the Shell distributorships in Texas. In other words, if you're buying Shell gasoline in the state of Texas, it's coming directly from Saudi Arabia because they're supplying their own refinery. So they're on a real terror to take over the market in the United States, and that drove a lot of independent producers and service companies and royalty owners into distraction when they did that. And so, our group here in Amarillo, Texas, Panhandle Producers and Royalty Owners Association, had Dr. Daniel Fine, who's an economist, come in and tell us how we might overcome that. But I think that's how the downturn started. And we're one group that's tried to do something about it. Sometimes we wonder if we're making much progress, but I think we have made some.
And what would you say to someone who might push back and say, well, okay, we see what you're saying about the Saudis, but the U.S. producers, they kept drilling at a high rate, and they didn't slow down when they saw the, maybe the edge of the cliff, if you will, and they were kind of their own worst enemies. What would you say to someone who might push back like that?
Well, I think we have to look at our U.S. producers as trying to create a self-sufficient country with respect to oil and gas production and consumption. Here in the United States, we consume 20 million barrels a day. And at the time the Saudis did this announcement, we were making about 9.7 million a day and buying the rest. When they knocked on the door and said, we're going to flood the world with cheap oil, our production dropped about 1 million barrels down to about 8.6 million barrels a day. So, we want to be self-sufficient. Why do we want to be self-sufficient? Well, we don't want to be buying oil from the Middle East. Terrorist part of the world, unstable part of the world. If we look at our U.S. defense budget, a good part of it goes to defend the borders of Middle Eastern countries and defend the seaways so they can send that oil out of that unstable area without capture. You all remember our own sailors who were held captive by the Iranians, and they were there protecting Saudi oil. Why are we doing that? Our calculations are that we're spending about $50 a barrel over and above what we pay for oil in this country in defense of the Middle East waterways and regions. And so that's a national security issue. And then in addition, when we buy oil, we're spending maybe $60 billion a day.
Right. Let me hop in there real quick, make sure I heard what you said. So let's just say, just for easy math, if oil's at $100 a barrel, what you're saying is because of the military budget, it's really costing U.S. 150 a barrel because of the
military budget.
Right, military budget.
That's a big item. A lot of people don't think about it, but and it's a big part of our defense budget. That the reason we got into that fix was we couldn't produce our own oil. Now we can. We have this international group out of Oslo, Norway, called Rystad Energy that has studied, for instance, our U.S. reserves as a result of horizontal drilling, and the reserves in our oil reserves in basins in the United States are determined to be 274 billion barrels of oil. That's more than the 260 in Russia and the 254 in in Saudi. So, we've come into a position where the oil's there, and we've got our own resources. Why don't we develop it?
Taking a quick break in the action to thank our sponsor.
For over 20 years, R Squared Global has served the energy and infrastructure industries. With offices in Texas, Alabama, and Louisiana, R Squared Global offers engineering, survey, right-of-way, and GIS solutions. For more information, please visit www.gor2.com.
Okay, so let me kind of reset the position here to make sure that the audience and myself are following along. If I understand the main thrust of your argument and what your group's argument is that the U.S. has enough oil to be self-sustaining for the most part, and we don't need to import specifically Saudi oil, maybe other OPEC nations as well, because of, on some level, A, it's costing the U.S. taxpayers $50 a barrel by taxes for the military budget, and B, it's potentially funding terrorist organizations. Is that kind of a 30,000 foot view? Okay.
You got it.
Thank you.
Good grasp of the situation, in my opinion.
A blind squirrel, I guess. So let me kind of help me understand. Let me just ask a few questions that people might go, okay, well, that sounds great, but so help the audience understand this. What about refinery capacity? Let's just start there. What would you say? Do we have the refinery capacity to refine all of our oil here, or would we still have to export the oil to other nations to get it refined?
Well, it's kind of a double-edged sword. We have the capacity, but right now the refineries are geared up for a heavier grade of oil than, for instance, a shale revolution is producing. We're producing lighter oils, and we are exporting about 1 million barrels a day of oil, the lighter oils, because our refineries here are geared for Soviet oil. So the owners of the refineries are somewhat against what we're proposing because they don't want to take the expense to retool their refineries to handle our own oil. That's somewhat of a problem. So we could handle our own oil, and if we had the refineries to change up a little bit in the way they do things to handle lighter oil.
Yeah, I'm not big on government subsidies, but it sounds like if we're paying $50 a barrel, we could divert some of that money to help the refineries. That would be national security.
I'm not big on the subsidies either. What we're doing is we're not calling for a tariff on this foreign oil. We're just saying let's embargo. I mean, let's have restrictions on the amount that we can have and that can come into our country. And some people say, well, you're just looking for a tariff to raise the price. That's not our agenda. But anyway, the refinery situation is a stumbling block to what we would like to do.
Okay, but I think there are ways, that we could work around that. But it would be one potential obstacle. One of the things that we experienced where I work at during when oil was $100 a barrel was a struggle to find qualified people because everyone is hiring. If we implemented this embargo, not a tariff, but embargo, so we quit buying Saudi oil. Where do you project oil would be at, and for what kind of stability would that bring to the market? Because at $100 oil, we like it because we all make a lot of money, but it is a little bit hard to kind of get a work staff that is qualified for long periods of time.
Yeah. Well, we're not really wanting to price oil, but of course, in the Permian Basin now they can make money at $50 a barrel.
Right.
Not very many other basins can do that. So, in my opinion, as a geologist that has been in the business a long time and has seen high and low prices, I like to say that we should have a price in this country that reflects the cost of production in all the basins in the U.S., and I think that's around $70 a barrel. And it doesn't need to be any higher than that, and we don't have to, and that would yield a little over $3 a gallon gasoline. And so that's something that, in my opinion, is doable.
Yeah, and stability, as you know, much better than I do, stability in the oil market is really what we all want, because the longer it's stable, the more employees that we can hire, and we know what our budget's going to be, and we can train people. We say we can devote a certain amount of our resources to training, and, it kind of gives us a good, steady flow to our workforce, whereas right now, when the price shoots up and it shoots down, you have people who are very talented, who will leave the oil patch and never come back just because they're afraid of the volatility.
Well, I on occasion speak to high school and college students about the geology and getting into the oil business, and they bring up, well, doesn't seem very stable. And during periods of high oil prices, things are great. When they go down, well, people get laid off, and that's true. It's been there's been a lot of cycles in employment in our industry that has driven people out, and a lot of people who have the experience, retire too early or go into some other field because they can't make a living in the oil and gas business, and that's tragic. But stability would help a lot in keeping people in the business.
Okay, and one of the other things your group is pushing for, and we'll link to your website in the show notes for the listeners to go check it out, is you're not saying you want to embargo all oil, if I understand, but just some oil, right? So there is some oil that you would still like for the U.S. government or the
well,
the
what we're suggesting, and I like to use the word quota rather than embargo, but we're suggesting that there be quotas on a good bit of foreign oil, principally OPEC, but that we have no quota on Mexican or Canadian oil, and that we form a North American alliance of production. As I mentioned earlier, we're close to 10 million barrels a day. Canada is close to 4 million barrels a day, and I should say 3.5, and then Mexico about 1.5 million. So, with us and them, we are currently close to 15 million barrels a day of our 19.5 needs. And as you know, right before 2014, when this OPEC action started, in the 5 years prior to that, our production went up about 5 million barrels a day due to the shale revolution and horizontal drilling and fracking. And we were on our way to self-sufficiency when it was interrupted by the Saudi action. And so I think within 4 or 5 years, with a North American alliance and continued shale drilling, that we can get to self-sufficiency.
Now, part of your group's initiative is that you're going for the top dog. You're going for President Trump, I guess, in this case, and the Secretary of Commerce to look at this and to figure out how to quota or embargo or however we want to piece that together with the Saudis. I'm guessing though, while it sounds, I can see where you're coming from. We're in so deep with the Saudis. It seems like it's a really uphill effort you got in front of you.
Well, I think it is, but I think it's doable. It's not something that's out of the realm of possibilities because, like I mentioned, we have increased our production in a 5-year time dramatically, and we can continue to do it. What we're complaining about to President Trump and the Secretary of Commerce is that this Saudi action, it's not free trade. When other countries force people in our industries in our country to go out of business, that's unfair trade. It's not free trade. And the Secretary of Commerce is currently looking at similar situations in the steel and aluminum and computer fields where other countries, principally China, has dumped product into our country that violates free trade agreements, if there are any, or just the concept of free trade. And so we're suggesting that they also look at the Saudi actions against U.S. producers to drive us out of business. And so that, along with another action which could be done by the president himself, a presidential proclamation that we put quotas on foreign oil other than Canada and Mexico, together those items would push us towards self-sufficiency.
One of the things that it seems like when I talk to folks who are close to Capitol Hill is we think of Washington, D.C. as this place where there are all these smart people, but they don't really understand the basics of what you're talking about because they're working off of these deals that have been in place for 20, 30, 40 years, this mindset around Capitol Hill. It's kind of old school. And so on one hand, it seems like, okay, you have this uphill battle to fight because of that mentality. On the other hand, what you're saying is, let me just kind of recap, if we put a quota on foreign oil, we could work out a North American alliance with our closest neighbors, which would be Mexico and Canada, which would be good for all of us to kind of bond together. We'd have a little bit more common interest there, especially as far as energy goes. We could help defund terrorism. And all the while, we're going to create American jobs and potentially create long-term stability in the oil economy. And if I've kind of heard all that right, it's a very positive message that you're trying to get out there. Is just trying to get past some of the misconceptions.
Well, that's true, and that's why our group has hired Dr. Fine to be our spokesperson, because he He's been at MIT. He's been on several think tanks along with the Heritage Foundation. And so he knows the ins and outs, and he knows who to talk to. And we began our action in 2014. Our idea was to talk to both Democratic and Republican presidential candidates to get our idea out there. And fortunately, the Trump administration won the election, and there were more positive people we could talk to there, and our message has been getting through. I know, the president himself said that he didn't think what Saudi Arabia was doing was good for us. Of course, then he went over there and pledged a bunch of money for them to increase their production by contracts with the U.S. service companies, and then pledged more money to help them defend their borders and things like that. But anyway, that was a diplomatic mission, and sometimes those things are two-headed snakes that you can't really figure out. But anyway, we know the Secretary of Interior and Secretary of Energy and the Secretary of Environmental guy, they've all said, we think we ought to be self-sufficient. And not only that, we ought to export to the world. And so we have people in power now that understand our message. And Dr. Fine is going to go back to Washington in a couple of months, and the Heritage Foundation is planning some meetings with government officials to talk more thoroughly about our plea to the Secretary of Commerce and our plea to the President to limit imports, and that these things will be good for national security, for our economy, for jobs, and those are important things.
And it's called the Panhandle Import Reduction Initiative. We will link to the website, which is panimportreduction.org for the listeners, so you can go check it out. Right. Mr. Cambridge, thank you so much. This was fascinating. I really appreciate what you're doing here, because it's you're just kind of boiling it down to simple math, right? This is what this costs. This is what this costs. Here are our options. And sometimes we especially in the oil and gas industry, we could kind of make stuff sound a little bit too complicated. But this is a problem that potentially can be solved. There are some obstacles, like we talked about with the refinery and with the labor force, but those things, if we had a little bit more of a stable long-term economy, and we knew that, hey, price is going to be about 70, the number you use there, 70, 75, for a long period of time, that I think would, give the market the stability that we need to begin long-term training programs and help these refineries kind of retool themselves. So I'm very encouraged by this, and we wish you the best of success. Is there anything that we didn't get to that you wanted to throw out there for us before we let you go?
Well, I think you've covered it nicely, and we appreciate our ability to be on your program today and talk about these things. We think it's of primary importance to the country, and as we talked about earlier, politics is sort of a cloud over this entire mathematical formula that we talked
right.
about, and so convincing people of what's going on and what needs to happen is. We're kind of an educational group, even though, we're hurt by what has happened financially, and that's why we're responding. But we're trying to educate the public about how we can be self-sufficient, how we don't have to be relying on these unstable parts of the world, and how we can encourage jobs and the economy in our own country. So thank you a lot.
The Global Energy Leaders Podcast is produced by Michael Sims and Chris Prine. Chris Prine also serves as editor for the Global Energy Leaders Podcast. Until next time, keep climbing.
Thanks for listening to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, powered by R Squared Global.